you know your story? You might say, well, of course I do. I'm living it. However, most people understand their lives as a series of unrelated calendar appointments. We'd be hard-pressed to identify our life's narrative plot, its major themes, or character transformations. Sometimes we feel more like a supporting cast than the main character in our own story. And that's why this fall at Salt House, we want to invite you to become a student of your story and discover what God is doing in and through the pages of your life. If you're struggling to find purpose and old wounds don't seem to heal, if you're trying to figure out what's next in my life and you have no clue as to where God is in any of it, then we want to equip you with some theological tools to read your story and begin co-authoring your life with God. The writings of Dr. Dan Allender offer some helpful categories to guide your season of story work, beginning with Shalom. This is where all good stories begin, in the peaceful garden, in the cozy Hobbit Shire, where innocence is intact, and we feel naked and unashamed. But the next act brings the shattering of Shalom. Apples are eaten, trust is betrayed, and vulnerability exploited. We become disoriented, widowed, orphaned, and we feel alienated. And what develops is called the core wound. Most of our lives are lived in Act 3, the search for Shalom. We try everything in our power to get back to Eden. We get straight A's, we grow the business, we discard imperfect partners, convinced we can put all the pieces of a shattered Shalom back together. Then comes the fourth act, always as a surprise, because real salvation can't even be imagined. It is completely God's doing. Wrongs become righted, reunions are sweet, and there's usually good food and drink, dancing and laughter. And there's just enough closure for the story to start again. If all of this sounds familiar, it's because it is the story arc of the Bible, and it is the story that God is writing in your life too. And that's precisely why we say here at Salt House, stories matter. Your story holds a greater glory to it, just waiting to be told. It reveals God. So, do you know your story?
Good morning, Salt House.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm loving these little stories, aren't you?
Yeah.
Let's hear a few more. I ate figs on the roof of my house, not worried about a single thing. And it was one of the best summer days of my childhood. I spent the afternoon fishing and catching frogs with my dad and uncle, then spent the evening eating fish and frog legs. The beach was one of the best summer days of my childhood. Well, to tell you about my childhood, I have to tell you about Thomas the Train. When I was a kid, my favorite thing in the world was Thomas the Train. Every morning, I'd climb on my parents' bed to watch Shining Time Station on Channel 6 while my parents got ready for work. My dad built me my first train table, and I had a train set that could not be contained. Like, my assortment of wooden Thomas the Tank Engines could rival any collection in the Smithsonian. Every aunt, uncle, and cousin got toured around the train set, and at least once a week when my dad got home from work, I'd ask him if we could build it a new way. It was with that train set that I learned how to make figure eights and build little hills and tunnels. If I'd been better at math, I might be an engineer right now. But that train set fueled my creativity. Like, construction paper could become a lake, and tissues could become mountains of snow. And all day long, I had Thomas just spinning around the track, like clickety-clack, clickety-clack, clickety-clack. Did you have favorite toys like this growing up? What were they? Books? Thundercats? Polly Pockets? Well, I got way too much there. Well, as I was working this sermon and thinking about my story, I'm I need props. I'm gonna go get a train set. I'm gonna put it on the altar. And then all during the sermon, at the climactic moments, I'll walk over and I'll run the train around the track. And so I went to a hobby store, because I'm like, hobby stores have trains, right? Like, you can get a train at a hobby store. And I walk in, and I'm like, hey, do you have a Thomas the Train set? And the kid was like, no, we sell real trains here. Yeah, I was like, oh, yeah, right? So I was like, okay, keep your real trains. And so then I went to a toy store, because I'm like, okay, Thomas the Train is a toy. We'll find it at a toy store. And I'm like, hi, do you have Thomas the Train? And she was like, oh, God, we haven't carried Thomas in forever. I don't think the kids are really into it these days. I was like, not true, good to know. I was like, what else is there to be into these days? So I was like, okay, if I can't find a train set, I'll get a book. Like, we're doing stories anyway, so like a little Thomas anthology book. I can set it up here on the altar. It'll be the same thing. So I go in a bookstore, and I didn't know this, but the children's section of a bookstore is not alphabetized. It's like, I'm not sure what it was. But there was a section on transportation and trains. So I'm like, okay, I can do this, like trains. Thomas was not there. So I was like, okay, there'll be like the little picture books, like the ones with the staple that, are bound and you have to file through them like it's a cabinet. Thomas was not there either. But they had a section on popular children's characters. So obviously. And I go and I'm checking, and I'm like, all right, we got Arthur, we got Clifford, we got Marvel, SpongeBob, Star Wars, and there was no Thomas the Train section in the children's bookstore. And I was like, wow, this is what we're talking about at Salt House this season. Like, all of us in our own stories have these childhood experiences of playful innocence. And all of us at some point lost it. And we've probably done things more crazy than going to a toy store to try and find it again. And that's why studying your story matters. We looked at this model that Pastor Ryan showed us last week when we kicked off this series about how your story starts in shalom, and then that shalom is shattered. And then we search for shalom only to find that we can't quite get it back. And then suddenly, unexpectedly, we are surprised by shalom. And so this week, we're going to start at the top. We're going to start with writing your shalom story, which raises the first question: what is shalom? And maybe you've heard this word. It's a Hebrew word that has kind of made it into our pop culture lexicon. And if you Google it, you'll find that shalom gets translated as peace, or sometimes God's peace, or you might find God's just peace. And that's not wrong, but I think it's too simple. Because peace is like snow falling on cedars, or like a starry night, or a soft piano solo. Peace is definitely part of shalom, and so is justice. But I think shalom is much bigger than that. The Bible describes shalom in the creation story, and it tells it like this. Before anything was created, when the earth was just a rocky little ball, God started creating. And God spoke, and rivers burst forth, and rivers flowed everywhere. There were rivers to the north where the gold was rich and good, and where there was resin and onyx. And the rivers flowed out to the east, to the plains, and to the mountains where they formed glaciers. And there were rivers in the south. And these rivers burst forth trees of every kind with fruit to eat and lush vegetation. And God looked at it and said, this is good. And then God formed from the dust an earthling, and he breathed into the earthling's nose, and the earthling came to life. And God looked at the earthling and said, this is good. And he made for the earthling a garden and placed the earthling in that garden, saying, eat of all of the trees. There are just two trees in the middle of the garden, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You must not eat from those trees. And the earthling played, and God saw that it was good. But then God said, it is not good that earthling is alone. So he created all the animals, all the birds of the sky and the fish of the sea and all the creepy, crawly little animals on the ground. And he brought each of them to the earthling to see what earthling would call them. And earthling gave each a name, but God didn't find a suitable partner for earthling. So one night while earthling slept, God split earthling in half. And when Earthling woke, he looked at his partner and said, "Surely you are flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone. We will be united as one." Do you feel that? That's shalom. This story is shalom because, yes, there's peace, but it's a different kind of peace. There are three things I notice about shalom. One, there's abundance. There are rivers and good soil, plants with fresh fruit, animals of every kind. There is flourishing and plenty and wanting for nothing. There's abundance. There's also connection. God knows it is not good for earthlings to be alone. God brings forth life for relationships. God brings people together. God desires and networks for us to be loved and to love others. No one is lonely in this garden beginning story. There's connection. There's also innocence. I mean, they play naked and are unashamed. You can't get much more innocent than that. So when was this time in your life? When did you experience shalom? When was a time that you wanted for nothing? When in your story were you held and cared for? When in your life was everything good and you had no knowledge of evil? I don't know about you, but I find these questions really hard. Because as Ryan told us last week, the shattering of shalom is inevitable. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil shows up in the story even before the animals. It happens to all of us, and it seems like it happened so long ago. I mean, on a practical level, most of us experienced shalom in childhood, and it's just hard to remember that far back. Like, we should have taken better notes. And yet something in us remembers. Like, do you ever hear a song or see a photo or reconnect with someone on social media and you're like, wow, I hadn't thought about that in years. But here's the thing. If we don't remember what shalom looks like, we won't know it when we found it again. And anything good or miraculous that God does in our lives or our stories, we'll miss it. If we don't remember shalom, we won't know it when we see it. So today, I want to talk about 3 tips for remembering. These are 3 ways that you might begin to write your shalom story, 3 ways that you might drift back across the years and recall a little bit of abundance and connection and innocence. How's that sound? All right, here we go. First, take a moment and describe the setting of your story. Every story starts with a rich, vivid picture of the world that you're entering into. This is the world building, or kind of like D&D. Like, this is the fun stuff. For example, listen to this opening from To Kill a Mockingbird. Maycomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. In rainy weather, the streets turned to red slop. Grass grew in the sidewalks. The courthouse sagged in the square. Somehow it was hotter then. A black dog suffered on a summer's day. Bony mules hitched to Hoover carts flicked flies in the sweltering shade of the live oaks on the square. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning. Ladies bathed before noon, after their 3 o'clock nap, and by nightfall, they were like soft tea cakes with frosting of sweat and sweet talcum. Doesn't that just draw you into the story? Like, do you feel the humidity? The setting of a story sets up so much of the drama. I mean, To Kill a Mockingbird would be a very different story if it was set in New York City instead of Maycomb, Alabama. Where your story starts matters. Did you grow up in a city, a small town, or the suburbs? Did you all pile into the family station wagon, or did you get dropped off for soccer practice in the minivan? Did your story move around to a lot of different places? Me, I grew up in the suburbs. My brother and I, we spent our summers at the neighborhood pool, cannonballing off the diving board and then coming home smelling like chlorine. My dad worked in HVAC then, and he'd bring home large cardboard boxes from water heaters and furnaces, and we'd turn them into racetracks for our Hot Wheels or time machines for our imaginations. We had a swing set in the backyard that could make any city park jealous. There were swings and monkey bars, a fireman pole, a 2-story treehouse, a climbing wall, and this swirly slide that ended right by my mom's lilac bushes. In the evenings, my brother and I would compete jumping off the swings to ask our parents who was the highest and the farthest and the craziest. Kind of takes me back when I think about it. The Eden story, that first Shalom, is full of rich details. This week, we read it in our staff meeting, and both Pastor Ryan and I were struck by all of the minerals that get listed. Like in multiple versions of the Bible, there's this verse that's like, oh, there was gold there, and it's really good gold. There are verses that talk about resin and onyx, and I'm like, what do you even do with resin and onyx? But these details speak to abundance. They speak to the lavish and good things that God gave us. They hearken back to a bygone era, to a place lost in time. They remind us of when we felt our every need was met. They take us back to Shalom. And not only does describing the setting make your story more interesting, the setting tells us something about the abundance that you experienced early in your story. And it wasn't the same for everyone. I mean, my suburban childhood was different than someone who grew up in the inner city or someone who shucked corn in the summers. But all children, for however brief a time, experience a feeling of abundance. And so next week, when we talk about the shattering of Shalom, you'll see that on this side of the shattering, we often live in scarcity. But there was a time that we didn't. There was a time that we trusted in the abundance around us, and that was Shalom. Can you remember that time? Can you get back to that place? The sights, the smells, the sounds? This is why the Hebrew scriptures echo this refrain of remember, tell your story, teach the generations of the good things God did. Because that was God's will for you, that you would feel abundance each and every day. God's will was that every day would be rich and full of all that you need. So when was a moment in your life that you felt that? Describing the setting might help you remember the abundance, but another trick you might try is to give some background information. Perhaps you can think of this like your origin story, like The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings. What was happening before your story began? I'll give you another example. This one's from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon charge for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm about to relate. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm about to relate. In A Christmas Carol, we have to know that Marley was dead, or the ghosts that haunt Scrooge don't make as much sense. In your story, I imagine there might be a few ghosts. There might be a few things that happened in your family of origin long before you were born, and those things might have shaped the first few chapters of your life. For example, I remember that train set my dad built. But what I didn't know is that my dad had not been a handyman for very long before I was born. He had been entrepreneurial his whole life, but the handyman work had been left to my grandfather and my uncle, his older brother. In fact, when my dad, Terry, first went into the HVAC business with his brother, his father, my grandfather, teased him. He said, "Terry, how are you ever going to do that? Your brother's going to have to tape the screwdriver to your hand." And the joke took off. His mother teased him. His brother teased him. "Terry, your brother's going to have to tape the screwdriver to your hand," haunted my dad. And he carried this embarrassment and just this inferiority with his family all the time. But as a kid, I never knew that. I just knew he built me a train set. And that train set was my favorite thing in the world. I loved when he came home and helped me build the track a new way. In my mind, there was nothing my dad couldn't build. I didn't know the shame in his story or how his story was shaping my story. So what family stories were you born into? Because the family you were born into might have had something to do with how your story shattered. There was probably some good and evil in your story long before you had any knowledge of it. I mean, remember, part of shalom is connection. In the Eden story, God says that it is not good for earthlings to be alone. So God was bringing people into your story before you knew it. And maybe some of those people didn't feel like connection. Maybe mom drank too much, or dad left, or your siblings teased you. Maybe there was a miscarriage, or a divorce, or a suicide. Maybe you were adopted, or you moved, or you were bullied. If that was your story, that wasn't shalom. That was the shattering. That part came later. The shalom God willed for your life was the connection. And remembering our origin stories helps us make that distinction. Your shattering story that we'll look at next week might have left you disconnected. But where was their connection before that? What complicated love story resulted in your birth? Who made you feel safe? Who held you? Who kissed the scratched knees? And what was going on in their life that you had no idea about? See, if we don't include our origin in our story, then nothing makes sense. We don't know where any of this came from. We don't know what paths we were placed on. We don't know whose voices shaped us. And we might mistake those stories for God's will in our stories. And that would be a big mistake. Because there are stories before your story that forever altered the course of your narrative. But God's will for you was abundance and connection, not any of those other things. So start there. Start with peeling back the layers of this chaotic world you were born into. What ghost from your origin story must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story you're about to relate. Okay, so one tip to remember your shalom story is to describe the setting. Another tip is to give the origin story. Finally, you have to tease out your sense of wonder. These are the dreams and goals that set your story in motion. So here's another storybook example, and this one is from Thomas the Tank Engine. Thomas is a tank engine who lives at the big station on the island of Sodor. He's a cheeky little engine with 6 small wheels, a short stumpy funnel, a short stumpy boiler, and a short stumpy dorm. He's a fussy little engine too, always pulling coaches about, ready for the big engines to take out on long journeys. And when trains come in, he pulls the empty coaches away so the big engines can go rest. But what Thomas really wants is his very own branch line. Thomas has a dream, his very own branch line, which if you know anything about tank engines is ridiculous. Because like tank engines move bigger coaches, they don't pull passengers. But Thomas has a dream. When you were younger, did you have a dream? I mean, think about the hobbies you had as a kid, maybe sports or dance or theater, maybe band, not the thing your parents made you sign up for, but the thing that you couldn't wait to sign up for. Do you remember how much energy you had for that thing? Like, do you remember the focus of practicing or the thrill of performing? Do you remember the wonder? The Eden story describes this as they were naked and unashamed. They were completely alive, authentic, exposed, vulnerable, and unashamed. I've been to Spain a couple of times, and each time I've seen a flamenco show. And if you've never seen flamenco, it's just incredible. Like, it starts out with sort of this stomping cadence that's really mechanical. And then as the music accelerates, so does the stomping. And at the crescendo, the dancer is like moving their feet so fast, the vibration shakes their whole body. And it's kind of like the dancer has become the music. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever felt like you were so consumed by your passion that you just became the music? I'm not sure I ever have. Because I think the reality for a lot of us is when our shalom was shattered, we lost that. We realized that life is not so simple. We stop pursuing our passions. We stop imagining. We lose that sense of wonder. And this is terrible because without a sense of passion or purpose or wonder, we go into survival mode. Like, we focus on the bottom line. We live out of fear and cynicism. We build walls that keep out hope. We let others define our worth for us. And this is so not the will of God. God says you were created for shalom. You were created to be at home. You were created with passions that the world needs. You were created for wonder. Our wonder is not just the dreams and goals we had as children. It is our gateway to our innocence. It takes us to a place where we are ignorant of pain and burnout and bills. It takes us to that place where anything is possible. I think this is why Jesus points to children when he speaks of the kingdom of God. Children are unaware and yet trusting in the goodness of others. Children are vulnerable and yet full of delight. Children are powerless and yet able to see wonder. Children live as God desires all of us to live. Children live in that shalom. And something else I learned when I was thumbing through books in the children's section? Children are very unskilled at putting books back where they belong. And so as I went through the popular characters of Marvel and SpongeBob and Clifford and Arthur, there were like 13 Thomas books misshelved. And they all cost like $1.40. So I was like, cool. I spread them out on the floor, and I'm like, great, I'll take these, I'll set them up, we'll have Thomas books around our little bowl, it'll be a much better prop. And then when it's over, I can take them home, and I'll be 30 with 13 Thomas books, and it won't be my train set, and it won't be my dad coming home to rebuild it. I won't be young again. I won't have my innocence back. I will still live in a world where I know way too much about good and evil. But don't you wish it could be different? Don't you wish you could feel that joy again? Well, that's what this sermon series is about, friends, because that's God's dream for you too. God created you for shalom. God created you to utterly trust in and experience God's abundance, connection, and innocence. That's God's will for your life. So friends, this week, may you glimpse that childlike wonder by writing your own story of shalom. If you haven't already, pick up a journal on your way out. Karen donated these journals for us, so grab one and take some time to write this week. I actually wrote part of this sermon by hand, which I had never done before. It was really cool. Take a moment this week and journal on these things that we talked about. If it helps you to remember shalom, then recreate the setting. Recall the sights and sounds and smells of your childhood. Reflect on your origin story and capture those family stories that you were born into. Write about the wonder, the things that fed your imagination and made you feel alive. Because you were created for Shalom Salt House. God looks at you and says that you are good. That is the first word of your story. May it also be the last. Amen.